The folder slipped from my hands before I could catch it. Papers scattered across the hallway floor contracts, marked drafts, and a small sticky note I'd written 3 weeks earlier. Don't forget the gift protocol. I crouched down to gather them. That's when I heard my name. Lena. Just that. And the sound of a chair shifting inside the boardroom. Everything in me went still. My name is Lena Ross. I was 29, and I had spent 6 years at Northbridge Pacific Holdings building one thing trust with our Japanese partners. Not just language, not just deals, trust. The kind that takes years and disappears in seconds. We were 3 weeks away from signing a $2 billion infrastructure contract with Takeda Infrastructure Group. 14 months of negotiation, 3 international trips, endless careful conversations. And I was the only person in that building who understood how that relationship actually worked. Then the new director arrived, Daniel Mercer. Fast, efficient, certain. He called what I built redundant, 9 days before Tokyo. He eliminated my role. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I just packed my things and walked out, because in that moment, I understood something he didn't. The deal wasn't held together by documents. It was held together by me. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you believe your value isn't something that can be replaced overnight. And I'd love to know where are you listening from. And what's the temperature like there right now? This is a fictional story, with some elements enhanced using AI to make it more vivid, but the emotions behind it are completely real. Now, let me take you back and show you what really happened. I didn't start at Northbridge as someone important. I was just the quiet graduate in the corner. The one people asked to take notes during meetings that were supposedly too complex for someone my level. Back then, my job title sounded small, and most people assumed my role was replaceable. What they didn't see was what I was actually building. I wasn't just translating words. I was translating intent, every email, every pause in a meeting. Every carefully chosen phrase carried weight in ways most of the team didn't recognize, and over time, I became the person who could read what wasn't being said. The first time I sat across from Takeda Infrastructure's team in Tokyo, I barely spoke. I watched. I listened. I paid attention to who poured the tea, who waited before answering, who deferred without disagreeing. By the second meeting, I understood the rhythm. By the third, they trusted me. That trust didn't come from fluency. It came from consistency, from showing up prepared, from remembering details no one else thought mattered, from knowing when to slow a conversation down instead of pushing it forward. There was a moment, about a year into the relationship, when their senior director asked me a question in Japanese and then stayed silent after I answered. Not a polite silence, a testing one. I held it. I didn't rush to fill the space. A few seconds later, he nodded. That was the moment everything changed. After that, conversations opened. Information flowed differently. Concerns were raised earlier, more honestly, but always indirectly. And I learned how to recognize those signals before they became problems. Inside Northbridge, none of this showed up in reports. To them, progress looked like timelines and signed documents. To me, progress looked like a slightly longer pause before someone agreed. It looked like a shift in tone. It looked like trust. And that was the part no one thought to measure. The contract itself had a weight to it that you could feel, even on paper, not because of the number printed at the top, although $2 billion has a way of making people sit straighter, but because of what it represented. 14 months of negotiation, alignment, and careful positioning had brought us to a point where both sides were ready to move forward. Northbridge Pacific Holdings had been selected as the preferred partner for a joint infrastructure venture with Takeda Infrastructure Group. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because every step had been measured, every conversation handled with precision, and every concern addressed before it had the chance to become visible. We had already completed the difficult part. The structure was agreed. The risk allocation had been balanced. The operational model had been reviewed by both technical teams. What remained was what most people would call a formality. I knew better. The final session in Tokyo was never about confirming what was written. It was about confirming who they were trusting to carry it out. The people in that room would not be the same people who negotiated the deal. They would be the ones responsible for executing it, living with it, and defending it internally. They needed to hear the answers themselves. They needed to ask their own questions, and they needed to feel that the relationship was stable, consistent, and respectful. The plan was simple. The first evening would be a formal dinner, where nothing about the contract would be discussed. That wasn't avoidance. That was respect. It was the space where the relationship was reaffirmed without pressure. The second day would be a structured review conducted entirely in Japanese. I would facilitate, not dominate, guide the conversation, not control it, make sure every concern surfaced in a way that allowed it to be addressed without anyone losing face. If everything moved as expected, there would be a brief closing ceremony. Quiet, precise, final. 3 weeks stood between us in that moment. Every detail had already been prepared. Or at least, it had been. Until someone decided that speed mattered more than understanding. Daniel Mercer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Control, for him, showed up in smaller ways, in how he leaned back slightly when someone was speaking, as if he already knew where they were going, in how he skimmed documents instead of reading them, then summarized them in cleaner, sharper language that sounded decisive enough to end discussion. After that first meeting, he began asking questions that sounded reasonable on the surface. Why is the dinner 3 hours? Why are we conducting everything in Japanese if both sides speak English? Why do we need 2 full days for something that's already agreed? Each question came with a quiet implication that what we were doing was excessive, that it could be simplified, that it should be faster. I answered each one carefully. I explained that the dinner wasn't about time. It was about rhythm. That language wasn't about comprehension. It was about respect. That the second day wasn't a formality. It was where the deal actually became real for the people who would carry it forward. He nodded every time. Then he made changes anyway. The dinner was shortened to a 1-hour networking session at an international hotel, more efficient. He said, the second day was restructured into a 2-hour presentation in English. We'll bring in interpreters, he added, as if that solved everything. I told him interpreters translate words, not relationships. He smiled slightly. That's what we're paying them for. Over the next 2 weeks, every adjustment moved in the same direction. Less time, less context, less space for anything that couldn't be quantified. Each time I raised a concern, he acknowledged it, then overruled it. There was no argument, just quiet dismissal. What unsettled me wasn't the changes themselves. It was how easily they were made, as if the process I had spent years building was something that could be compressed without consequence, as if the relationship would hold, regardless of how it was handled. And as I watched the structure shift piece by piece, I realized something I couldn't ignore. He didn't understand what was holding the deal together, and because of that, he believed it didn't matter. If you think the CEO's decision to remove the only Japanese-speaking liaison at that critical moment was justified, comment agree. But if you believe it was unfair, write no in the comments. I'm really curious to hear what you think. The changes didn't stop. They accelerated. What had started as small adjustments became a complete rewrite of the process I had built over 6 years. Every layer that carried meaning was gradually removed, replaced with something faster, cleaner, and, in Daniel's words, more aligned with global standards. He called it optimization. I called it erosion, the dinner, which had been carefully selected as a traditional setting to signal respect and continuity, was moved to a neutral hotel space with bright lighting and fixed time slots. There would be introductions, light conversation, and then a polite exit. No room for the kind of slow, unstructured interaction where real trust deepens. The review session was compressed into a 2-hour presentation deck. Slides, bullet points, summaries of conversations that had originally taken months to unfold. I watched as nuance was flattened into clarity, and clarity, in this case, was a problem. Because what we were dealing with wasn't confusion. It was sensitivity. Every detail in that agreement carried context. Why a clause was written a certain way. Why a timeline included extra space. Why a responsibility had been framed indirectly instead of assigned directly. Those weren't inefficiencies. They were solutions. Solutions to concerns that had never been openly stated. I explained this again, carefully, calmly. I told him that removing those layers wouldn't simplify the process. It would remove the signals that told the other side we understood them. He listened. Then he said, "You're overcomplicating it." That was the phrase. Simple, dismissive, final. After that, the conversations became shorter, not because I had less to say, but because I understood that what I knew no longer carried weight in the room. The timeline continued moving forward. The Tokyo trip was still scheduled. The contract was still in place. From the outside, everything looked intact, but inside the process, something essential had already started to fracture. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to matter, and just enough that when the pressure came, there would be nothing holding it together. 9 days before we were scheduled to fly to Tokyo, Daniel asked me to come into his office. There was no urgency in his tone, no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. Just a calendar invite placed between 2 other meetings, as if this was another routine discussion. When I walked in, he was already seated, a printed organizational chart laid out neatly on the desk. My role was highlighted in red. He didn't look up immediately. He adjusted the paper, aligned it with the edge of the table, then finally met my eyes. "Lena," he said. "I've been reviewing the team structure." I nodded, waiting. "I think we're carrying some redundancy," he continued. "Your position sits in a bit of a gray area between business development and administrative support. Going forward, we can redistribute those responsibilities more efficiently." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood, not the words, the timing. "You're letting me go," I said. He didn't hesitate. "We're restructuring." The word landed softly, too softly for what it meant. I glanced down at the chart again. 6 years of work reduced to a box someone had decided could be removed without consequence. "Effective immediately?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "HR will follow up with the details." There was a pause. Not the kind that invites conversation, the kind that closes it. I considered explaining. About the Tokyo meeting, about the relationship, about the things that weren't written down anywhere but mattered more than anything in that room. I didn't, because in that moment, it was clear he had already decided what was important, and it wasn't what I knew. So I nodded. I thanked him for letting me know. Then I stood up and walked out, back at my desk. I packed quietly, a notebook, my laptop, the small details that had accumulated over 6 years of being in the same place every day. 2 colleagues looked at me, confused, then concerned. I gave them a small smile. "It's just restructuring," I said. I left the building with a single tote bag, no announcement, no transition, no acknowledgement of what I had been responsible for. And as the door closed behind me, the deal was still moving forward. At least, that's what they believed. There were things I chose not to say as I walked out of that building, not because I didn't understand their importance, but because, in that moment, none of it felt like it belonged to me anymore. I didn't mention the clause, Appendix C, Paragraph 4, a continuity provision that had been inserted at the request of Takeda's senior director during our second trip to Tokyo. His wording had been careful, almost understated, but very clear in meaning. He didn't want to build a relationship with one person and then be expected to finalize it with someone else. At the time, I had translated it exactly as he intended. At the time, everyone had agreed. I didn't remind Daniel of that. I didn't point out that removing me from the process, especially this late, would not be seen as a minor staffing change. I also didn't explain what would actually happen in that room without me. That no one there would recognize when hesitation meant discomfort. That no one would catch when a polite question was signaling a deeper concern. That no one would know when silence needed to be respected instead of filled. Those weren't skills you could brief someone on. They were patterns learned over time, and time was the one thing no one thought mattered anymore. There was something else I didn't say. A month earlier, I had been approached by another firm, Arden Strategic Advisory. They had been trying to enter the same infrastructure market for years, and through the quiet channels that exist in any industry, they had heard about me, about what I did, about how I worked. They offered me a senior role. I hadn't given them an answer, not because I wasn't interested, but because I hadn't been ready to leave until that moment. Standing outside the building, the city moving around me like nothing had changed. I took out my phone and called them. "Is the offer still open?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "Yes," he said, "I'm available." I replied. I started the following Monday. The Tokyo meeting was scheduled for Thursday, and for the first time in 6 years, I wasn't part of it, not visibly, but that didn't mean I wasn't still there, just not in the way they expected. I didn't need to be in Tokyo to understand how the meeting unfolded, but I still heard about it, partly through a colleague who messaged me late that night, partly through the quiet way news travels in industries like ours, where people don't say much directly, but everything eventually becomes known. Daniel arrived with 2 members of the business development team. Neither of them spoke Japanese. They had hired an interpreter through an agency. From what I was told, she was technically precise, accurate in vocabulary, careful in delivery, but she didn't have context. And in that room, context was everything. The dinner took place at the hotel, just as Daniel had planned. Structured, efficient, contained. Takeda's senior director attended with his team. They were polite, courteous, engaged in conversation the way professionals do when they are observing more than participating. At some point during the evening, he asked where I was. The question was translated simply. Daniel answered just as simply, "There have been some internal changes. She's no longer with the company." He said it casually, as if it were a scheduling update, as if it didn't carry meaning, from what I was told. The director nodded, and then continued the conversation. Nothing changed on the surface, but everything underneath did. Because silence, in that setting, is not empty. It's communicative, and the quality of his silence shifted. He spoke when appropriate, responded when addressed, maintained the rhythm of the dinner exactly as expected, but he offered nothing beyond that. No openings, no signals, no reassurance. The next morning, the review session began on time, 9 o'clock. By 11, the interpreter was already struggling, not with the language, with the structure behind it. Takeda's team communicated in a layered, formal style, meaning sat between phrases, inside pauses, behind carefully chosen wording. The interpreter translated everything correctly, but flatly, without dimension. At one point, one of the junior directors asked what sounded like a clarification about payment scheduling. Daniel answered immediately. Confident, direct, complete. What he didn't realize was that the question wasn't about payment, it was about timing, and not just timing confidence. It was a signal, a careful way of saying something wasn't aligned. And in that moment, he missed it. Completely. Across the table. The senior director watched and said nothing. At 12:30, the senior director requested a break. It was phrased politely, routine. Nothing in the wording suggested anything unusual. His team stood with him and stepped out of the room. Daniel's team stayed seated, waiting at 1 o'clock. They hadn't returned. At 1:15, an assistant entered and, through the interpreter, explained that the director had been called away for an urgent internal matter. The afternoon session would need to be rescheduled. That was the last conversation they had that day. The following morning, an email arrived at Northbridge headquarters, 6:15, early enough that most people hadn't reached their desks yet. It was from Takeda Infrastructure Group's legal department, formal, structured, precise. It referenced a breach. Appendix C, continuity of designated liaison personnel. The removal of the named liaison without prior consultation was identified as a material deviation from the agreed terms. The wording was careful. They were pausing the negotiation pending resolution. They didn't say the deal was over. They didn't need to, in that context. A pause meant withdrawal, a controlled exit, an opportunity for the other side to preserve dignity without forcing a public collapse. Inside Northbridge, the response was immediate. Legal reviewed the clause. Multiple drafts of a reply were written, then rewritten, then escalated. What had been treated as a minor internal decision was now a contractual failure. 3 days passed in that state. 3 days of trying to repair something that had already shifted beyond reach, because the issue wasn't the clause itself. It was what the clause represented. Trust. And once that was broken, there was no language that could restore it. The call came on the 4th day. I recognized the number immediately. It was Richard Hale, the CEO of Northbridge Pacific Holdings. We had spoken a handful of times over the years, always briefly, always in the context of results. Never process. Lena, he said. His voice measured. I imagine you understand why I'm calling. I do, I replied. There was a pause. Not long, just enough to acknowledge what neither of us needed to explain. He asked if I would consider returning in a consulting capacity, temporarily, to help stabilize the situation with Takeda Infrastructure Group. He said they would make the arrangement worthwhile, that they would ensure I had full authority to manage the relationship, and then, more quietly, he said he was sorry for how things had been handled. I appreciated that, I really did. But it didn't change anything. I told him I had already started a new role at Arden Strategic Advisory, that Arden was operating in the same market, that any involvement from me would create a direct conflict of interest. Another pause. Longer this time, I see, he said. We both understood what that meant. The call ended politely, professionally, and finally, 6 weeks later, the deal was formally withdrawn. The announcement was brief. Strategic realignment, mutual decision, no further comment. $2 billion, 14 months, gone. Daniel Mercer's role was restructured 8 months after that. I heard about it the same way I heard everything else. Quietly, indirectly, by then. I was 3 months into my new position. Better team, better leadership, better understanding of what I actually brought to the table. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard what happened. That's the part people don't expect. There was no satisfaction in watching something fall apart. Just a quiet clarity. The deal didn't collapse because I left. It collapsed because someone believed what I did could be replaced. And the truth is, some things can't. Not quickly, not cheaply, and not without consequence. I chose not to argue, not to beg, and not to stay where my value was reduced to something replaceable. And in doing that, I learned something important. The right people don't need to be convinced of your value. They recognize it. If you were in my position, would you have done the same? If yes, write yes. If not, write no. And if you're still thinking about it, write time. I'd really like to hear your perspective. And if this story resonated with you in any way, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing it, because your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, and that makes you more valuable than you think. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.